That up.
Right. Welcome, everybody. Great to have you all with us. My name is Jens Hilke. I'm a conservation planner with Vermont Fish and Wildlife. And our guest star today is Joanne Garton from the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. We're here today to talk about resilient right-of-ways. And I'm going to get things started, but the lion's share of today's webinar is with Joanne. So without further ado, we'll get this going so we can hear the main event. First, a bit of housekeeping. You've passed the test. You've successfully gotten into Microsoft Teams. Thanks for bearing with us. This session is being recorded. Feel free to turn off your video during the recording and just turn it back on at the end. We'll have some time for Q&A. Also, please mute your microphones. I think everyone is muted already, just during the recording so that we don't get any feedback. Lastly, if you would please find the chat button. That's going to be the best way to ask questions during the presentation. Please feel free to ask those questions in the chat during the presentation. We're going to take a break every 10 to 15 slides or so and check in and see if there are any questions. And Dave will read those as they come about. So that's the best way to get your questions answered. And if you go ahead and introduce yourselves on the chat, just put in your name and what your town or any boards you serve on, that would be a great way of helping us to get a sense of who all's here. We will be providing a few resources to you on the chat, so keep that window open as we go. All right. Today we wanted to handle, I'm going to talk just a little bit about wildlife road crossings and make the connection between the work that I'm engaged in with the Fish and Wildlife Department and the work that Joanne is engaged in with resilient right-of-ways. And just make that link a little bit more clear. Then Joanne's going to jump in and first talk about the context of the Resilient Right-of-Ways project, the elements of a Vermont back road, and then get into this concept of stewardship of the back road and some of the roadside management scenarios. So that's the plan for the next hour. As I mentioned before, while Joanne is with Forest, Parks, and Rec, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, we believe in the conservation of fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. So that is a big mission, and Dave and I are the Community Wildlife Program, and so we offer technical assistance to Vermont municipalities, just as Joanne does. Our work is focused on the wildlife side of things, offering presentations and workshops, as well as interpretation of resources. We work very closely with regional planning commissions. Our role is more to interpret the data and the science and get that science ready for planning at the municipal level. Okay, so wildlife road crossings. I just wanted to begin this very quickly by talking about wildlife road crossings because at Fish and Wildlife Department, that's something we're very interested in. And so I often share models like this with towns as they're engaged in land use planning, particularly related to Act 171, the Forest Integrity Bill, that requires towns to identify their forest blocks and connectors. And so wildlife road crossings are an important type of connector between forest blocks. And so we use models like this that identify where there's good quality habitat on both sides of the road. And those places are likely to be important for wildlife movement across the road or under the road. So what you see on screen is the wildlife road crossings model for Route 12. This is often called Moose Alley. There are quite a number of moose that cross Route 12, and it's a road segment that we're really interested in. So I just wanted to give you a sense of the type of data that we're offering as a way of helping towns with that Act 171 requirement. if we look at actual animals and how they're moving across the road, the models certainly get us started. This type of telemetry data can really help us fine tune where different species are moving and where different species spend their time. We're now in Shelburne on Route 116 at the northern part of Shelburne Pond. And you can see here, those yellow dots are bobcat points every 20 minutes for during dawn and dusk hours for about 6 months. And so you can see that where that bobcat has spent most of their time in the forested habitat over on the east side, on the St. George side. Deep in these wetland habitats, there's tall grasses, and the wetlands freeze over in the winter, and so there's plenty of places to hide for bobcat and a lot of good habitat for hunting. They're also using the edges of the farm fields. But look at this hedgerow across that leads up to both sides of Route 116. From a bobcat perspective, that short hop following that hedgerow was enough to connect the good quality habitat from the east with the good quality habitat in the west. So for this species, that hedgerow was enough. So let's just zoom in even more there. And so this is, as you're heading south, this is what that segment of Route 116 looks like. And it's not particularly remarkable, that hedgerow. I know motorists drive past that all the time, often at high speeds, and might not even notice that it's a particularly important crossing. And yet, for that bobcat, just this little bit of forest cover close to the road within the right-of-way was sufficient to allow for wildlife movement. So we can talk about over-the-road crossings. And often there's no infrastructure underneath to help allow movement. And yet there's still opportunities to maintain genetic exchange, like land protection, land use planning, reducing vehicle speeds, looking at traffic volume. There are opportunities to address those over-the-road crossings. And then, of course, there are under-the-road crossings. That really allow bobcats like this to use that little shelf moving under the road. So I just wanted to briefly introduce these concepts. I think, Dave, if you please put in the chat, there's a link to a webinar that we did on wildlife road crossings if you'd like to learn more about that. But I just wanted to introduce the connection and be clear about how important that roadside habitat is to allow for wildlife movement. Okay, so I know that was just a quick snapshot. Are there any questions for me at this time in the chat before we hand it over to Joanne?
Well, it looks like there's no questions this time, but I'd like to invite everyone and remind you that you're welcome to type out any questions you have as they come. Even during the presentation, type them out in the chat, and I'll be keeping track of those and I can read those during the next break. Or if you'd like, you can hold your questions to the next break. And we'll have several more of these break slides intermixed in the presentation, so it'll be an opportunity to field those questions. Joanne, you ready to take it away?
I think so. I think I've done everything correctly. You're still seeing the question slide?
Yep.
Great. Thanks, Jens. Thanks, Dave. My name is Joanne Garton, and as Jens mentioned, I work with the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program. I think there's maybe 7 or so participants on here, and I think I know at least 2 of you already through your work with our program. So thanks for coming to spend more time talking about trees. The Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program is, sorry, just having a few too many windows open here. I'm gonna move this over here. There we go. So the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program is has a bit of a funny structure. So if you're not sure sort of who you've met with our program staff and where they work, you're not alone in being a little confused. So the program, like the Community Wildlife Program, does offer technical, financial, and educational assistance to municipalities statewide. And there are currently 5 of us on staff in this program. 3 of us, including me, work for Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation in the Forestry Division. And 2 others work at University of Vermont Extension, doing a lot of the educational work and outreach. So together, the 5 of us make up this program, but we do get to travel statewide for this work. And that is really one of the greatest pleasures of the job for me, is being able to go to a lot of interesting places and meet all of you. As the technical assistance coordinator, I really do get to do a lot of the boots on the ground work of visiting the community work that people are doing, understanding what kind of is easy there, what isn't, seeing what trees are there, what condition they're in, how that varies from town to town, and then really helping people connect their stories to each other. But the work that I'm going to talk to you about today is kind of a precursor to the job that I hold right now, which was a grant-funded project called Resilient Right-of-Ways that had focus on both vegetation management in urban areas, or developed paved downtowns, and vegetation focus along the rural backroads. And what you're looking at on this slide here is one of the main deliverables of this grant-funded section of the project. This was a landscape scale restoration grant project that ultimately allowed our program to work with 10 pilot towns, including East Montpelier. I saw Steve Justice is here. And so he'll recognize this road on the cover page. It's a road in East Montpelier. And then create this guide, essentially take the work from these 10 towns and create a guide that will be helpful to all municipalities statewide. And it really did involve combing around on a lot of back roads, on dirt roads, and talking to a lot of people. So the project, because of the grant funding initiative, actually had to occur in the Lake Champlain Basin. And at first, when I was kind of welcomed onto the team and said, like, go forth and look at trees and vegetation along rural roads and figure out what to do, we were trying to be a little strategic about which towns we might try to work with, and had this kind of early map of towns that had various water quality problems that have been reported at the state, and that we may be trying to really connect some of the water quality initiatives with roadsides. I had done some master's work looking at best practices to reduce erosion from roadsides, from unpaved roads, and particularly sediment load and phosphorus load, to examine, what we can do to reduce the phosphorus loading into our water bodies coming from back roads. And for anyone who is in Vermont this summer, anywhere, you probably saw a road, particularly an unpaved road, turn into a river at some point when the precipitation got pretty out of hand. But ultimately, some of our work ended up being a bit more opportunistic, as a lot of conservation and ecological studies are. We jumped in early with 4 towns: East Montpelier, Calais, Stowe, and Charlotte. Should have its red circle over there by the lake, who really had committees and groups of people that were ready to think about roadside vegetation. They particularly, in the lens of ash trees, they had already maybe been thinking about the impact the emerald ash borer would have on rural roadside forests. And so I was able to start working with folks there as early as 2017. We were able to hire a University of undergraduate summer intern to do really the bulk of the field work in those 4 towns, and adding another 4: Tinmouth, Hyde Park, Johnson, and Marshfield. And then lastly, I think I saw someone is from Plainfield is here too, scooping in Plainfield and Panton, with kind of a slightly different focus. In Plainfield, we did a lot of ash inventory, and in Panton, we were really connecting some of the work there to the basin plan, and understanding kind of what some of the vegetation goals could be in Panton, which is a very agricultural town right on the lake, with respect to water quality and active agriculture. So it was these 10 towns that ultimately fed into what you're going to see in this guide today. And just to step back a little bit, why does this even matter? And what the heck is a right of way anyway? So part of this guide really got at that of clarifying what a right of way is and how that vegetation, both trees and any type of vegetation, agriculture, play into this broad swath of municipally managed land. So there's about 7,600 miles of traveled unpaved roads in Vermont. I think there's someone from Agency of Transportation here too. So the numbers may be checked, but I'm pretty sure it's still about that. And when you think about, the right of way is often, but not always, 3 rods wide. So that's 49.5 feet wide in total. And literally on the back of an envelope, I scratched out sort of how many acres is that? That's, maybe land that is possibly municipally owned, but is usually owned by someone else, but managed by a municipality for the sake of a safe and traveled road. And that's over 45,000 acres of back road right of way in Vermont. And some of that is taken up by the road, and the road could be 12, 13 feet wide. It could be 30 feet wide. So I spent a lot of time with a tape measure out there measuring road widths and right of way widths, vegetation sides, and took a bunch of averages and really estimated there's just over 27,000 acres of manageable right of way back road vegetation that could look a bit like this. It's from a road in Hyde Park, and it's a really weird swath of land. It's these narrow strips that could border private property, often, sometimes state property, sometimes municipal property. And that property could be a continuation of what you see in the right of way, could continue forest or could continue agriculture, or it could be something completely different that changes at this arbitrary line. That's really a difference of how land is managed, whether by the private landowner or the landowner at that spot, or managed by the municipality, primarily for the purpose of safe travel, but as we'll see, also for many other reasons that come as either intended or unintended consequences of having a road in this space. So just to give a little picture tour. Oh, no, not quite for the picture tour yet. A quick overview of what this work entailed. Essentially, in each of those 10 towns, I was able to visit about half the road mileage there, either myself or with our summer intern. Usually went on a bicycle. Gotta say, it's a great way to go look at trees. Sometimes we were in cars together, very rarely on foot, just because it was a long walk to manage all these miles of roads. And roughly every quarter mile or so, we would be taking, essentially doing a super fast research plot of something typical that's happening there, pulling out sort of a bunch of land use information, dominant tree data, information about the road width and the actual side of the road that's being managed by the town or not, noting any certain problems, and really starting to pull together this map of like spot data along all of these roads. So there were almost 1,400 plots overall assessed during these couple of summers. And 71% of those were forested, but within that, largely, early successional forests, so very sticky, maybe very populated with. On the left there, you see an aspen that had come down in a recent windstorm. Trees that got there pretty recently. There's some mature forest, but a lot of this, like a lot of Vermont, is regrown pasture or cleared land. And certainly a lot of beech thickets, a lot of forests that from a forester's perspective, may be quite hard to manage, and certainly from a road crew's perspective, may be hard to manage. You're not quite sure which trees are going to do what along that roadside. And most importantly, I think, is that we've created just 10,000 plus miles of forest edge. And for those who study ecology in any way or land use planning, we know that the forest edge habitat is both vitally important for certain types of wildlife and also a real avenue for problems. Trees that are not used to being exposed to wind or light suddenly are when there's a road, and you may experience different levels of wind throw. invasive plants coming in with equipment that maintains the road. And then certainly with regard to wildlife, wildlife crossings in some of these places, it's both an absolute joy to see wildlife crossing the road, and can be slightly scary if you're the driver. And it definitely is a reason in Vermont it's a reason to allow yourself some extra time to get wherever you're going, because you never want to be in a rush on any of these back roads, because there can be so much to see. So that's kind of a really interesting scenario to be thinking about, and what we hope to in our program keep having both road crews, but conservation planners, and really anyone who's traveling on these roads thinking about how we've built this very long line of forest edge habitat through our forests in Vermont. So what does it all look like? Let's just go for a little virtual drive to see kind of what some of these roads might look like. And here's a couple that are in pretty good shape. So you'll see some mature trees, absolutely, along the side of the roads. You'll see some very mature trees, often sugar maples that people can be very attached to emotionally. Steve will recognize that tree on the far right there is an ash tree that we can say is a culturally important ash tree. It's a spot where folks in town drive up to the top of this hill and park there and go for a walk, because it's just the most incredible view of the Worcester Range. You see agriculture, on the left here is a bunch of corn. This is down in Tinmouth, but you'll see all kinds of things growing, either, right up to the edge of the right of way or even into the right of way. And that might include sugaring operations now. You see vegetation that's acting as a living fence, whether for privacy or noise or wind cover, or even as a snow fence. You see trees that are really the last thing between the road and maybe even your demise off the edge of the hill here or into a water body. They're either providing slope stability or really acting as a visual marker to help delineate the edge of the road, and hopefully to a certain extent filtering some stormwater. On the right there, that's a pretty thin border of trees, but vitally important there. You see people growing stuff in the right of way, either the town planting in its municipally managed land, or the private landowner planting just on their side, just over the right of way on their property. And these are trees that are, really, you could say, providing a public good. They're here for everyone to see and everyone to benefit from. You'll see other people trying to cultivate certain plants all the way up to the roadside. And actually, just a moment before starting this webinar, I was flipping through the news, and there was a whole article about sunflowers in the right of way in Johnson, and they had been planted as part of this beautification project, and ultimately met their end with a mower that it's a little unclear why the person mowed, but it really got to the heart of this issue of, like, what is a right of way and who manages it? How do we make sure that things that are planted really belong there and don't start to impede other objectives as safe travel on a road? Overhead utilities, absolutely a big part of our roadsides, particularly through our rural areas. And this is a roadside on the left here in Stowe. And really just, kind of mind blowing. You see Japanese knotweed and dying elm, dead elm, dying ash trees, and utilities. And there's a river, just below what you're seeing. And it's a tough landscape to manage well for all kinds of ecological priorities and safety. And speaking of safety, you see a lot of risk trees that have to the end of their life along the roadside, but for one reason or another aren't coming down yet, aren't being taken down, often because it's expensive. You see reforestation on the left there. What used to be a clear mowed area or brush hogged area is growing back into its own forest. Maybe the tree species you want, maybe not. You see a bunch of invasive plants, and that shot in the middle is from the town of Calais, where they were, for those who have experience or live on one of these rural roadsides, you'll know that often mowing can be one of the biggest vectors of spreading invasive plant seeds or fragments. So, understanding how to battle the invasive spread in each town was part of this project, and providing some recommendations and lots of maps of invasive plant locations. So in this shot, they were trying to reduce mowing and they had a crazy wild chervil population, not unusual at all. We're trying to remove that, remove the plants by hand pulling. And that shot on the right there, picture, is mowing gone wrong. You see those tree branches that are really just chewed up, and that's in fact the flail mower being put up into the trees to really cut back the edge of the tree line along a road for passage, for view shed. This is not the way to prune. It ultimately really damages a tree. It doesn't cut the tree branch right at the branch collar where the tree can seal over, but it's certainly not uncommon to see this type of roadside maintenance happen along rural roads. You know, some of these towns have upwards of 100 miles of rural roads that can be kind of difficult to maintain with nuance. A couple more pictures of the slideshow. So ash trees, I mentioned that in a couple of towns in this grant work, and then further on too, our program works a lot with ash trees in the rural roadside and managing what the impact of emerald ash borer will be for those ash trees and for road passage. We've got tons of infrastructure related to runoff. Here, culverts. Culverts are a big deal for all kinds of reasons. And work great when properly sized, but can also really lead to a lot of erosion. And this was actually an interesting spot in Panton, where the fence there is on private land, but the runoff from the road was creating all this erosion and taking the fence with it. Got some really beautiful mature trees that do all kinds of crazy things along the roadside, where they're suddenly either on a steep slope or exposed to a lot more sunlight than maybe they were before the road was there. Really, really beautiful and hard to replace. And ditching, this might be a big part of your municipality. There's a lot to say about ditching and how and when it's done and how it works to reduce sediment and phosphorus loading coming off of the roadsides. But absolutely, it makes up to CRI to a big part of the landscape of these roadsides. And the flip side of ditching is often this erosion. And these pictures are a couple years old now. And certainly, again, for anyone who was here this summer, you've really seen erosion at great scales and beyond this, when the roads, with being a little sunken, become vectors for high velocity water flow. So we're going to take questions or a break just in 1 second, but I wanted to lay out kind of the two remaining sections of this webinar. And the first is to really pick from a few items in the first section of the guide. And I've got the guide here. It's actually a printed item and available digitally. So the guide is divided into two parts. And again, it takes all these lessons from these municipalities that participated in the study. And today we'll just hit on, we'll just hit on 3 of them just to give you a taster, and then you're welcome to download the guide and look through all that, or I can mail you one. But getting into like widths of what's manageable, we'll talk about roadside ash impact, and we'll highlight some tree health and mechanical damage to large trees. And then the second section that we'll talk through super fast are kind of all the processes that you might be taking part in your community to be part of a roads committee, a roadside vegetation committee, or to work with your road crew, to work with the select board, to work with private landowners. Maybe you're the tree warden, and some of these trees in the right of way were planted by the municipality and thus under your jurisdiction as the tree warden. So we'll dive into all that, kind of little tasters of the two parts of the guide. But before we do that, any questions or thoughts or reflections or stories? I'm not hearing anything. Dave, do you see anything at the moment? Oh, you're muted.
Dave, you're on mute.
Thanks, Beth. So nothing in the chat right now. If anyone has a question right off the top of your mind, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask it at this time. But again, I encourage you to type any questions in as they come, and I'll definitely keep track of them.
Great. Yeah, we're only maybe 7 or so folks, so don't be shy about jumping in. Particularly Steve, if we end up looking at pictures of your backyard somewhere in here. So um, just again, just kind of there's each of the 2 sections of the guide have 10 kind of bullet points within them. So we're just going to touch on a few of those. So you get a taste of what is in the guide. But this first one is really like, you'll notice something I sort of conspicuously omitted clear description of earlier in the presentation, which is like, what is the right of way and what is the manageable vegetation? And I would say that a lot of people don't really understand what a right of way is through their property. Not because they can't understand, but maybe it's never really been that important. They know that there's a road that goes to their house and it's maintained by the municipality, and that's really kind of all they need to know. There are, however, and certainly in all these rural areas, a lot of people who work with their land, work on their land, and they may know a little bit more about tree management as you approach the edge of the right of way, because they understand that although they own the land and the trees on the land, the town has management rights of the entire right of way. And again, this is usually 3 rods. So you can see here on the picture, that's 49.5 feet. And it's made up of these sections. And this is what I called them. These are not sort of legal definition words that are in statute, but you've got the traveled surface. Hopefully beyond that, some element of a cleared zone for both visibility, but also pushing snow off the edge of the road. And then some ability to pull off the road, which, as we know, in many back roads, there may not be that space. You may be in the trees or off the side of the hill if you go particularly far off the road. And then what's left is really the manageable vegetation that can be managed by the town. And if those trees are not shade trees, and that term is defined in statute, a shade tree is a municipally planted tree in a municipal place or a municipal right of way, then those trees, if they are not shade trees, can also be managed by the landowner. So this can lead to some conflicting thoughts and information, and certainly safety issues if someone is felling trees near the road without notifying the town, even just for safety reasons, to make sure that there's no one in the road when these trees potentially come down the wrong way. So just, I mentioned we stopped every quarter mile and took a couple of quick measurements and a look around. And one thing we did do was measure both the width of the road, so that traveled surface, and then the width of those cleared zones, if they are there on either side of the road, did a little subtraction and ended up with some kind of width of actual manageable vegetation on each side of the road. So just to show you one of the maps, this is from Hyde Park, and where all those red lines are and blue dots are the routes that we were able to track, and that was with input from the municipality, from the group there that was weighing in on this work. And in this picture, the bigger the circle, the wider the manageable vegetation was on that side of the road. So still in the right of way. So we're getting something as low as 1 foot of vegetation, and that could even just be taller grasses or invasive plants even, all the way up to close to 15 feet of vegetation on either side of the road, which is a pretty deep swath of forest, particularly if it extends further into other forests there. And this is habitat. These are growing trees. These are all kinds of natural resources that in other areas we might have very specific management objectives for, but along roadsides can often be a bit of a free-for-all because the people that are caring for that vegetation have so many other duties while they're at this, at the work of figuring out tree care. Sometimes in some municipalities, the tree warden plays a pretty active role in advising the road crew on what to do with these roadside forests, even if they're not, if those trees are not shade trees. The tree warden, as a community resource, may still be working with the road foreman to understand which trees might go, which trees might stay, which trees are going to grow up into that next generation of resilient canopy. So that ended up with a lot of, basic information about how wide the roads were in each town. And we did have a little table comparing all the towns, and it's pretty interesting. It must, be related to the equipment that people have in each town. Every road is exactly the same width, it's exactly 23 feet. In other towns, it varies widely from 12 feet across on the tiny roads all the way up to, over 30 feet wide or wider where there's some busy areas. Quick taster into another section. I mentioned ash trees earlier as being a big part of our work. And certainly in urban areas, ash trees, green ash trees in particular, are planted widely, very widely, especially post-Dutch elm disease in the 70s. They're trees that do well in very wet areas, and as such, their roots are able to survive in compacted soil that we often find in urban areas. And so they became a very popular street tree, which now, of course, are threatened by emerald ash borer, an invasive forest pest from Southeast Asia that feeds on all of our species of trees, native ash trees here in Vermont. But the couple pictures here are actually white ash, and they can just be gorgeous trees. They're a very common tree. They're about 5 to 7% of Vermont's forest. Last weekend, just by chance, I was down in Marlborough, Vermont, so near Massachusetts. And it was just amazing how many roadside trees were ash trees, big ash trees all over the place, white ash. There may emerald ash borer, and here it is, the little guy. Up on the top, you've got the adult beetle itself, and on the bottom, the larva. And I think 3 of the 4 instars there of its kind of growth cycle before it magically turns into that green beetle. Although the adults do eat the leaves of the tree, it's actually the larvae that do the most damage by essentially girdling the tree. They create all these little S-shaped galleries that cut off the nutrient flow to the tree. And although 1 or 2 or even 10 or 50, the tree might survive, once there's a real infestation of the beetle, it does kill the trees. There are some studies showing white ash to be a little more tolerant of emerald ash borer than our other native species, green and black ash. But ultimately, it's a fairly certain bet that at some point the white ash as well will succumb to emerald ash borer. And that's a real safety issue for roadsides. That map on the left there is the current screen grab of kind of the heat map of where emerald ash borer is in Vermont. It's not everywhere, but it's almost everywhere in Vermont, and certainly all of our neighbors all around New York, Quebec, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, have many infestations as well. In fact, here in Vermont, we're a little later to the EAB party than our neighbors. So I work a lot with road crews, rural road crews in particular, to really help them first understand what they're looking for. Say, do you have 5 or 10 or tens of ash trees along your road, or hundreds? And quite honestly, many towns, particularly, we know from some folks who have done inventory, they have upward of 4,000 ash trees in their rural road right of way. And we start to make a plan. There's all kinds of ways that ash trees can come down, and that could be proactively removed by arborists, or they could fall down when they're infested. And there's a not real EAB on the right-hand side there, but that's how emerald ash borer primarily spreads, is someone picking up some wood on the edge of the road and taking it away, taking it off to camp or wherever, and that ash wood happened to be infested already. So really even getting down to that level of, okay, if we take down some ash trees in the right of way, how are we going to ensure that we're not spreading emerald ash borer at the same time? So there's a couple pages in the guide about the impact of roadside ash. And I will say, if anyone has any questions about that work, and particularly for folks in Plainfield, we did a pretty comprehensive roadside ash inventory of about 2/3 of the roads in Plainfield a couple years ago. And I know that there's quite a lot of emerald ash borer in that area already. It's certainly, it's always a good time to be thinking about the impact of this on the roadside ash, and how proactive or reactive your municipality wants to be. And I can definitely point you towards a lot more resources, or even kind of walk and talk with you out in the field. Kind of switching topics abruptly, but one last little taster from this half of the guide. You may see a lot of roadside trees that look like these. And while they are curious looking and definitely like feats of engineering to stay up in the sky still. These is a pretty common sight along our roads, particularly as our plows get wider and the equipment we use gets wider and our demands on the road become more severe. We're really trying to get out no matter the weather. You know, some of these are caused by mechanical damage, being hit by machinery or worse by a car during an accident. Others are tree health issues. There's in that middle there, that's Utapilla canker, and you know whether that started because of a impact to the tree or for other reasons. You know, the result is a tree that may just fall down sooner than you expect. So in some of the work that we did, we were able to make some maps of, you know, where the tree canopy was in fair or poor condition, where we saw a lot of damage to the trunks of the trees, pulling out places where we saw both like unhealthy tree canopy and a lot of damage to the trunk, and taking a bunch of pictures. I think this isn't Stowe, but we were able to kind of take some examples and be like, all right, what's in these places? What does it look like? Is it the trunk of the tree that's continually being hit? Is it damage to tree roots because of a widening road or recent ditching? You know, if you take out 30% or more of the tree roots during ditching, the tree's probably not going to live, but it'll be a couple years before you see that damage. And really starting to help a town come up with a plan for how to manage these trees. Many towns are a bit fearful of pegging these trees, of saying like, oh yes, we see a risk tree, because they're worried about liability. Once it's noted and marked, will they be in trouble if it falls down tomorrow? And the answer is it depends, but there's always good reason to have any type of plan that's within the reason of your municipal budget and capacity, as opposed to having no plan at all and not even acknowledging where you might find risk trees. Because trees are living, they're always getting older and always getting a little closer to dying, and certainly roadside trees live a pretty hard life. So thinking about placement and safety, and then of course, resiliency. Which trees are doing great? Which trees are we going to keep to grow into the next generation of roadside forest? So taking those field studies and sticking them into our guide, there's a couple pages. Each section of the guide kind of has this overview, recommendations with links to different tools that might be useful, and other resources that can connect you to this topic. So that was kind of a taster through the 10 elements of the Vermont backroad, you know, that stuff that you see all the time, and which little part of that you might want to play a role in. So we have one final section of the webinar, but before we get there, we'll take a quick pause and see if there's any stories, reflections, complaints so far.
There's no questions in the chat, so I'd again like to invite you, since we've got a small group, if you'd like to unmute yourself or put yourself on video to share your question, we can do that right now. Otherwise, you're welcome to type your questions in the chat. There's still one more section to come.
Sounds good. If you're like me, you're potentially during these webinars also eating lunch. So you may be waiting to get your last forkful. And it's definitely been a real plus of pandemic remote working, because then you can catch these webinars really during your lunch hour anytime. So this last section, I mentioned, you know, that the guide is broken into these two parts, that again, there's these green pages here that are all the elements of the back road. And you may find that like addressing one of these elements and understanding it is all that you can do. Like there's just a lot going on the back road. And for example, overhead utilities might be the thing that you're learning about in your town, and how to best work with your utility company or companies to plan for long-term healthy tree pruning so that your utilities don't get knocked down by trees. And really being quite proactive about that relationship. That may be plenty for one person or one committee to work on and understand along your municipality. So the second section of the guide is going to have all these little orange pages, and I have some pictures to show you. They're generally just to keep your attention, because a lot of these are about processes as opposed to certain things that we'll see on the roadside. So we'll brush through. I'll briefly touch on all 10 of them. And then leave you with some links and ideas and your thoughts for future work. Again, we did print this in September of 2020. That's when the project wrapped up. There were changes to the Vermont tree warden statutes. Neil could tell you all about them as Brandon's tree warden, and those were actually signed into law in November of 2020. So we saw that coming. We saw that there were going to be some changes in the guide as related to the statutes, but we had to go to print. So if you are looking at the digital version, we did a whole bunch of updates this past April, and that's reflecting all the new and updated tree warden statutes. So bear with me for a sec, but here we are. This is 3 of our 5 team members planting a shade tree in the municipal right-of-way in the town of Windsor earlier this spring. Unrelated to the guide, but just letting you know what that looks like. So, but speaking of tree warden statutes and all kinds of rules regarding to trees, related to trees, definitely one of the first, once you've done some inventory and assessment and talked to everyone, having a tree ordinance or tree policy in your municipality is a really big step in getting organized towards understanding tree care as it relates to your very specific municipality. There are, of course, some laws you have to follow, but really getting a lot of expectations down in a tree ordinance or policy is a big organizational step towards understanding tree care. It's also not super easy. That's something that our program can help guide you with if your town does not have an ordinance or policy already. And for our rural communities, this could be pretty creative in having to decide, which trees are we going to designate as having more public good than other trees if we're not looking at a whole swath of sort of downtown, urban center, village green, municipally planted trees. So please reach out to me or anyone in our program about kind of getting a bit more information of that. And also our website has some examples of other towns' tree ordinances and policies. This gets into some of the amended tree warden statutes. We can geek out on those a little bit later, or maybe even a different webinar. But it's important to understand what the law is regarding trees in public ways and public places. So we've talked about this one, and we could talk for hours and hours about emerald ash borer and managing ash tree health, but that's absolutely kind of the spot we're in right now in Vermont. And know that with trees, you'll never be eliminating risk, but certainly understanding it and mitigating it to some extent is a big part of maintaining safe roads and maintaining a safe road crew as well as they're working along these spaces. Addressing risk trees with the tree warden. So some of these trees are a little scary and they're certainly not easy to take down once they're dead or dying. And when those trees are outside of the right of way, when they are on private land, we're talking about a very kind of different beast of managing that tree when it is in fact a private tree that's certainly in the right of way. But for trees that are in the right of way, it's certainly within the jurisdiction of the town and the tree warden who may be able to help you assess. I mean, hopefully not on this tree, but there are other trees where maybe you need a little bit more assessment to figure out the health of the tree and whether basic pruning and care could restore that tree or give it a good long life, or if it's a tree that may need to come down. And having a reasonable plan in your community to address risk trees as capacity allows, and budget. Know your partners and understand their goals. There's a lot of things going on in the right of way. We talked a bit about utilities. There's road crews, there's public works, there's private landowners. There are people concerned with connectivity around their town. There are new landowners who maybe have come from another state and they don't know kind of what all the laws are and expectations about the right of way. This is a group in Johnson that just has a really well integrated committee of folks who are doing exactly this, kind of bending over maps a lot and trying to be really comprehensive about communication in their town. It's pretty hard. Supporting diverse and native roadside trees and plants. I didn't get into this a ton yet, I will in just a moment, but when you are removing vegetation in the right of way and you might see that hydro cedar, it kind of sprays a green gunk all over the side of the road. There's grass seed in there, and there are a lot of mixes that are even recommended by Agency of Transportation that are not native grasses. And that has a lot to do with maintenance and mowing and how robust they are. But there are some municipalities trying to plant more native grasses and understand how to best care for them and keep native plants in that area. So in the guide, there's a little call out section on roadside grasses and how to understand a bit more about those seed mixes. Inevitably, the seed mixes with native seeds are much more expensive than kind of the standard conservation mix. But a couple of towns have been willing to give it a go and start planning their budget differently in their implementation. So roadside mowing, I talked a bit about this earlier, and this absolutely relates to invasive plants. One, because it can spread, seed and fragments can spread on the machinery. And two, sometimes mowing invasive plants once a year, twice a year is exactly what sort of like aggravates them and has them come back with a vengeance. So sometimes there are a lot of reasons to do multiple mowings per year to keep back some biennial native invasive plants. So, again, this mowing practice, this isn't invasive. This is just which way your flail mower points. And then to understand if you have trees encroaching on the right of way, who's going to prune them properly? Understanding how herbicides are used. But yeah, it's all this stuff. You've got great, this suite of honeysuckle, buckthorn, knotweed, barberry, multiflora rose, chervil, roadside chervil is a really big deal. And if it gets into farm fields, the cows won't eat it. So there's a lot of reasons to try and keep it out of your rural road right of way. So what we tried to do was make a little bit, this is kind of that roadside mowing policy section, make a little bit of a phenology calendar of when these common roadside invasive plants are flowering, when you might want to mow them if you're trying to control them, and when you really don't want to mow them, when they've gone to seed, and if you mow them, you'll just be spreading it all around everywhere. I loved how, some of the information we were pulling from vtinvasives.org had you mowing in like March, which would be a very difficult time to find anything to mow along a Vermont roadside. So it's tricky. The mowing that needs to happen is much earlier in the year than most municipalities are mowing for visibility issues, but it can be done. I think in Calais, they started mowing a couple times a year. Some plants will need mowing 5-6 times a year to keep them down. So that might be a very targeted effort. Scooting into the end here in our last few minutes. Understanding the role of trees in updated stormwater regulations. Some of you might have worked with the municipal roads general permit, and that gets into a lot of ditching requirements for municipalities. So really, when someone starts to talk about, oh, we have to ditch, getting a sense of what that really means in your community and what the statutes say about that and what the funding refers to is important to understand before you kind of go out with your guns firing about tree removal. And that's, perhaps another webinar too with someone from Agency of Transportation. And alongside that, maintaining back roads and ditches to specifications. There's a lot of specifications about how to maintain these roads. And here's the grader coming down the road, just as I happen to be standing there. This is both an art and a science to use the grader well. You get a lot of that grader berm, which is just sort of a pile of leftover on the side of the road that does nothing good for any part of the road. But understanding, what your road crew is trying to meet with regards to that road specifications. And really prioritizing which roads are going to be high traffic and wider and super well maintained, and which roads really aren't going to meet that level of maintenance, and what other benefits you might get from that, as well as some hardship from perhaps not traveling smoothly on it all the time. Second to last, we've got create and maintain a public relations plan. And folks in East Montpelier could probably talk about this a great deal because they went through a whole series of steps to remove some roadside ash on certain sections of road. And they did their first project right near the high school. And the reason for that, there are many reasons, but one was because of high visibility, to really start to talk about what's going on and why you might see people practicing forestry, practicing silviculture in a rural road right of way on municipally managed land. I love this picture on the top right was a crew, I think it could have been in Corinth or Vershire. I'm not sure which town, I'm not remembering. they were out there in March looking out, inventorying all kinds of things along their road, trying to get a good picture of the impact of roadside ash. And as you can see, they were very enthusiastic. And lastly, keep abreast of funding opportunities. There's a bunch out there, and our program, the Urban and Community Forestry Program, does have open for application now our 2024 grant announcements. Long story short, if there is a tree-related initiative you're thinking of in your municipality, then there may be some money for that, and I'm happy to chat more about that. We don't have time to cover too many of our roadside scenarios, so I'll just show you a couple more pictures of towns that were dealing with elements of backroads and stewardship processes to come up with a good solution. This was a neat one in Tinmouth where they were trying to make a living snow fence out of roadside corn by leaving some of the corn in place to stop snowdrift across the road. And in our remaining couple of minutes, we'll scoot right to a couple of links on the page and any thoughts from folks on the chat.
Great, thank you, Joanne. So we have two questions. First, Ellen has a question going back to thinking about utilities and wants to know a little bit more about the relationship of the Green Mountain Power plan to put lines underground and its impact on trees, including roots. Ellen, did I capture that right? Is that your question? Just wanting to know a little bit more about that. Joanne, maybe you can take the question, and if you want to clarify, Ellen, yeah, go ahead.
I'm afraid I don't have a lot more information about that. Yes, that's her question. I mean, generally, it seems like a great idea to get them underground, given the number of conflicts we have with trees. I don't know where that's planned to be, if that's planned to go through forested areas or not. I'm gonna have to punt this question because I don't feel well enough qualified by it. I am gonna put in the chat the name of someone who can answer it, and he's really a great resource. I'm just looking for my chat button here. Oh, here it is. His name is Jared Wilcox, and Jared, and he is the right-of-way vegetation manager for Green Mountain Power, and Green Mountain Power's line width or length across the state is just enormous. His job is endless. But he's super passionate about talking about this. For better or for worse, you'll get a lot of emotion with it, the answer. But he really is knowledgeable. And that is maybe a question that I could follow up with him and then circle back to Ellen. We must have your email address on our registration, I'm guessing. Okay, so that is my homework.
Great. So I know we're butting up on time, so I'll leave this to you to answer if you think you can take it briefly. Bernie's question is there a minimum width of a strip between the road and the sidewalk to grow trees? It's the short version. Right.
The sidewalk, so in more of an urban area, I just put the slide back there, Bernie. Yeah, there is. So if we're talking about a place where there's a road, maybe a bit of grass, a sidewalk, and then someone's front yard, so maybe not the rural roads, then I would say the minimum, although not great, is 4 feet. It'll work. It'll depend what species you're working on, and quite truthfully, how your road crew manages the sidewalks. And much better would be 7 or 8 feet. That gives you a lot more flexibility about the root spread. You know, it's interesting that a lot of people, and rightfully so, aren't super appreciative of roadside trees between the road and the sidewalk because of the roots. They can start to bust up the sidewalk. But I think that gets to a lot of maintenance as the tree grows. You'll notice that the road isn't buckling where the roots are going out in that direction because the road is maintained differently than the sidewalk. You'll have some trees, some people ask about deep rooted trees, like can we just get a tree that's going to go straight down with its roots and not out, so that we don't have this problem. And although oak trees have some pretty good tap roots, there's still tree roots need oxygen and water, and they're always going to be headed out instead of straight down. So is there more to the question there? Yeah. 3
I think
feet, a
there
little
is.
less. Yeah, mature trees growing. Yeah, they will grow in 3 feet. Again, it's, the pruning early on in its life to raise the canopy. So make sure you're not crashing into the branches, either as a pedestrian or as a driver, is a pretty big deal. And that has to be done incrementally over time. Certainly if you come and whack off 40% of the bottom of the tree on one side, it won't be a thriving tree. And you hear a lot of truck drivers saying like, oh, I went down this road and like, every single branch hit the top of my trucks and broke the mirrors. That's not a fault of the tree. That's a fault of how it was pruned over time and what kind of traffic expectation you had along that road. So I did recently plant a tree in a probably sub 4-foot right of way, and that was because of a lot of permission issues. It's an Amermachia. It's going to be a smaller tree, but it still didn't feel great trying to do that. We could definitely use a bit more space, and maybe to add on to that, a lot of towns are working more with private landowners to plant in the front yard. So essentially, the municipality will pay for it and plant the tree, but then it becomes property of the private landowner in exchange for that landowner agreeing to water it, take care of it, particularly during the first few years. And you've got kind of all the benefits of a roadside tree without the crash with the curb and the sidewalk. And lastly, to circle back to that funding, I've got the slide up now. The U.S. Forest Service, our program funnels a bunch of U.S. Forest Service money into us and out to you, to municipalities. And a big change this year compared to previous years in funding is that you can use that funding to plant trees in private property. Again, that's like just beyond the right of way in the front yard with landlord agreements, kind of some caveats. But being able to do that, I think, is really opening the door to having trees that have got a bit more of a chance at life. There are so many competing issues, bigger vehicles, bigger equipment, underground utilities, that it's becoming harder and harder to find a place to put a tree in an urban right of way.
Thank you so much, Joanne. And thank you everyone for coming. We're gonna stop there for time, but we really appreciate you all joining us today. And another big thank you to Jens and to Joanne for sharing this webinar with us. And have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.